Greetings to everyone. Today's story is about Janet and Tom, who met on a sunny day in the park and fell in love at first sight. But what happened next? How long did their relationship last, and how did it end? Let's find out step by step. Let's begin by learning a bit more about these two people. Janet was the kind of person who could pique someone's interest within minutes of meeting. She grew up in a family where honesty and openness were prized above all else, so she had learned to express what she thought, yet always did so tactfully. Her parents, a former musician and a language teacher, instilled in her a lifelong passion for books, art, and various forms of self-expression. As a result, Janet developed a keen emotional awareness and easily understood those around her. Tom was different, calm, detail-oriented, and somewhat dreamy. From a young age, he loved creating things with his own hands, which led him to develop a passion for architecture. While his friends were out playing or socializing, Tom spent hours at his desk sketching imaginary cities and buildings. When they went to clubs, he preferred reading design magazines or watching lectures by professional architects online. His family always supported his enthusiasm, ensuring he never lacked inspiration or motivation. Returning to that fateful sunny day in the park, Janet had taken a break between university lectures to clear her head. One of her favorite pastimes was watching life unfold around her, observing passers-by hurrying about their day, children running across playgrounds, and birds fluttering from tree to tree like tiny performers on nature's grand stage. She settled on a bench with a psychology book in hand, thinking about how someday she would become a professional in that field. Meanwhile, Tom had come to the same park searching for inspiration for a course project at his architecture school. He believed that nature, the sounds of the city, and the flow of people were perfect triggers for creativity. He enjoyed making quick sketches of everything that might spark an idea. The shapes of leaves, the smooth lines of park sculptures, even the color contrasts between different flower beds. And so it happened that, while Tom was looking for a good spot to sit and sketch, his gaze crossed Janet's. It wasn't that she was staring at him. She had simply sighed in fatigue at the very moment their eyes met. Yet there was something about that sigh that intrigued Tom. He couldn't explain why he felt the need to go up to this stranger, but an inner voice urged him to make the first move. Approaching her, he was slightly nervous. Though not socially anxious, he was more introverted and rarely initiated conversations with strangers. Still, something about Janet made him want to take the risk. She had placed her phone aside and wasn't absorbed in any gadget. She looked relaxed and open to the world, and that sense of warmth drew him in. "Hello," he said, trying not to show his nerves. "I was looking for a place to do some sketches and spotted you. Would you mind if I sit here?" Janet looked up with curiosity, then smiled and said she didn't mind. They began chatting, at first about the weather and the park, then gradually about who they were and what they studied. The conversation flowed surprisingly easily. Janet explained that she was studying psychology, that she was curious about human emotions and behavioral patterns, and how they formed during childhood. Tom listened intently, occasionally nodding and making small drawings in his notebook. She asked if that was distracting him from the conversation, and he reassured her it helped him focus, as he liked having another channel of expression while talking. Within 20 minutes, they were laughing together at stories from their university lives. It turned out they both adored coffee. Tom loved espresso with lemon, while Janet preferred caramel latte. After a pause, he suggested getting something to eat at a small cafe near the park, and she happily agreed, feeling the same ease in his company. At the cozy cafe tucked behind a row of trees, they spent another hour or two, sipping hot coffee and sharing their thoughts on books, films, and music. They soon discovered they had favorite bands in common, and even some mutual acquaintances at the university, though they belonged to different faculties. It was clear they would see each other again. Indeed, a week later they met again in the same park. Janet brought him a psychology book she had recommended, and Tom brought his architectural sketches, thinking they might intrigue her with their shapes and daring ideas. That evening, they had a lengthy conversation about how people construct their inner worlds, just like cities, and how those structures could possibly be redesigned the way one reshapes an urban landscape. Their meetings became more frequent, first once a week, then twice, and before long they were talking almost every day. They wandered through the city together, visited small art galleries, attended public lectures, and enjoyed open-air concerts. A wonderful sense of ease, like they'd known each other forever, grew into something deeper. Without any formal declaration, they both knew they were now a couple. Over time, their initial romantic euphoria evolved into a more profound bond. They began to see different aspects of each other's personalities, habits, quirks, strengths, and weaknesses. Janet was highly emotional and often reacted impulsively to situations. Tom found it endearing but occasionally overwhelming because he was used to a more measured approach. Meanwhile, Tom sometimes took hours to respond to messages because he was lost in his drawings or lectures, and that frustrated Janet, who needed emotional contact almost constantly. Despite these minor clashes of temperament, they stayed close, trying to be understanding toward one another. Communication was key. Janet, with her psychology background, knew how to analyze her own feelings and articulate what wasn't working. Tom, though quieter, tried to listen and share his own thoughts. This openness allowed them to minimize conflict and move forward. One of their most memorable experiences was a mountain trip with friends. Tom had always dreamed of reaching the highest peak in their region, but had never found the time or company. Janet, though not an experienced hiker, immediately agreed because she loved adventure. During the climb, a heavy rain forced them to camp halfway, spending the night in tents. In those rough conditions, they discovered how much they truly supported one another. Everyone was soaked to the skin, but instead of panicking or arguing, they treated it like a thrilling escapade. Tom wrapped Janet in his warm sweater, and she brewed tea over a small burner, adding dried herbs and sugar. Their tent was cramped but cozy, and they huddled there, listening to the wind in the trees and the steady tapping of rain on the canvas. The memory of that night left them with an unforgettable sense of warmth and unity. Back home, everyday life awaited. Tom had to finalize complex drawings and prepare for a major exam that would determine whether he qualified for an international architecture exchange program. Janet faced her own set of tests in psychology and was about to begin a practicum at a local clinic. Their responsibilities grew, leaving them less time to spend together. Nevertheless, they tried to carve out a few hours for coffee dates or evening strolls. They especially treasured quiet neighborhood streets, away from busy roads and crowds, where they could walk side by side, holding hands, feeling like characters in a slow-paced play about two people in love. The more they learned about each other, the more future plans they made. Janet dreamed of opening her own psychological center, offering not just talk therapy, but also creative workshops, meditation groups, and emotional support sessions. Tom longed to design a new type of building, an art space that was both functional and inviting, featuring modern facades, large panoramic windows, and a spacious inner courtyard for exhibitions and lectures. Their ideas seemed so intertwined that they soon discussed collaborating on a charitable project. They envisioned a mental health center built in a contemporary, welcoming space where every guest would feel safe. Janet saw it as her chance to implement her methods and become a respected psychologist, while Tom viewed it as an opportunity to gain renown for an innovative design that balanced beauty with social purpose. Around that time, Tom received an invitation to interview with an international architectural fund that arranged exchanges for students worldwide. If he passed the interview, he'd spend a year working in Europe. He felt both honored and afraid, knowing such a move meant a long separation from Janet. But she, nervous as she was, insisted he should at least try. Their support for each other was genuine. On the day of the interview, Janet cooked him breakfast, eggs and vegetables, plus coffee, and tried to calm him before he left. She stayed home, anxiously waiting for him to return, aware that this interview could redefine their future as a couple. When Tom came back, his expression was unreadable. He looked both happy and worried at the same time. He had passed the selection process, which meant he had 3 months to prepare his documents for the move to Paris. He felt proud but also uneasy. This opportunity could jeopardize the plans he and Janet had been building. Upon hearing the news, she was thrilled for him, yet saddened by the idea of a looming separation. Thus began a tense period leading up to his departure. They knew they weren't breaking up, but they realized that a year apart would test them both. Janet tried to stay positive, thinking she'd throw herself into her practicum and schoolwork while Tom gained professional experience abroad. Then, once he returned, they could build something even more ambitious together. Still, as the date of his flight grew closer, they fell into more frequent silences during dinner. Each tried to hide their sorrow, so as not to upset the other. On the night before he left, they decided to stay home, watch documentaries on architecture and psychology, and then simply sat together in silence, arms wrapped around each other, gazing at the stars through the window. At the airport, everything happened so fast. Hugs, quick kisses, final parting words. Tom didn't promise it would be easy, but he swore he would do everything he could to ensure they'd be together again. Janet tried not to cry, reminding herself that this was only the beginning. She promised to write every day, sending him updates, big and small, so he'd feel as if he were still part of her life. Tom's new reality in Paris was extremely intense. From the first weeks, he was introduced to a major architecture firm for his internship. Life in a major European city was unlike anything he had experienced at home. His days were filled with meetings, visiting museums and exhibitions for inspiration, and trying to squeeze in late-night video calls with Janet. Initially, it felt romantic. She sometimes got up at 6 in the morning to catch him in the evening after work, or he would stay up late under the glow of a desk lamp while she was having her midday break. But over time, the time difference and demanding schedules started wearing them both down. They missed calls, lost messages in endless chats, and occasionally went several days without talking. The emotional distance began taking its toll. Janet, understanding psychological mechanisms, tried to maintain balance by focusing on her studies, her clinic practicum, and even taking up sports. Still, she felt increasingly unfulfilled by short good morning or good night messages. She craved a deeper connection that screens couldn't provide. Tom was also unhappy. He felt himself drifting away not by choice, but by circumstance. After long hours of work, he was often too exhausted to hold meaningful conversations, sometimes falling asleep before he had the chance to text her back. Professionally, things were going great. Industry professionals noticed him. He received invites to events, and his calendar quickly filled up. Yet his personal life began to fracture, and he didn't know how to fix it. After several months of uncertainty, Janet and Tom scheduled a long video call to clear the air. They agreed to be open and honest about every emotion, sadness, anger, or disappointment. The conversation was painful, but necessary. Janet admitted that maintaining a relationship through a screen felt increasingly unbearable. Tom confessed he felt guilty, as though he was betraying their plans by being so far away. Still, they resolved to wait until his internship was over. Tom's contract lasted a year. After that, he could come back with valuable experience and perhaps continue collaborating with the European firm from home. They promised not to make any rash decisions and to remain a couple despite the distance. That decision brought them some relief. They coordinated their schedules, setting specific days for video calls and text messages. Janet spent more time with friends to fill the social void. Tom tried to stay engaged in her day-to-day life, though there were comedic misunderstandings. He'd text her while she slept, or she'd be busy when he was free. 6 more months passed like that. Meanwhile, Janet completed the first phase of her clinical practicum and received praise from her supervisor. She participated in group therapies and helped people struggling with anxiety and fear. This boosted her confidence in choosing her field. At the same time, she started thinking about opening a small private practice after graduation, aware she still had much to learn. Tom's career skyrocketed. His ideas for modernizing historical districts earned praise from influential figures in the architectural world. He was invited to speak at several conferences, traveling to Berlin and Milan, meeting other professionals who shared their insights on innovation. As he grew professionally, He began to question his personal life even more. He didn't want to lose Janet, but he realized he was changing as a person. No longer just the introverted dreamer who sketched buildings. He was now a young architect with genuine prospects. Meeting ambitious people in Paris fueled his own ambitions. For the first time, he considered staying in Europe longer than a year. The possibility both scared and thrilled him. Janet sensed that he was becoming emotionally distant. He spent more and more time talking about new projects and less about the everyday details of her life. She tried to share funny stories from her practicum and discuss new techniques she was learning, but often got lukewarm replies or was interrupted by calls from his colleagues. The more she felt him slip away, the less she was willing to carry the conversations alone. Then, about 2 weeks before he was due home, Tom got significant news. He was offered an extension of his contract for another 6 months, plus his own project to manage. Essentially, it was a path to permanent employment, official hiring in a French firm, living in Paris for the foreseeable future, designing buildings in one of the most beautiful cities in the world, and garnering major professional accolades. Tom agonized over the decision. He wanted to return to Janet and feel the warmth of her arms and her laughter that always lifted his spirits. Yet this was a rare chance that might never come again. As a driven man, he knew he might regret it forever if he turned it down. But would he regret losing the opportunity for a shared future with Janet even more? When he finally came home after his year abroad, the outcome became clear. At first, their reunion was joyful. They hugged, laughed, and reminisced about how things used to be. Janet baked his favorite apple pie, and they watched all the films they had postponed for later. Underneath this happiness, though, lingered an unspoken tension. Janet noticed Tom's behavior had changed. He often fell silent when she asked about his experiences, or else he spoke too enthusiastically about his plans, which no longer seemed to include returning for good. One evening, they decided to talk openly. It was likely the hardest conversation of their lives. Tom admitted he'd been offered an official position in Paris. He hadn't wanted to hide it, but feared her reaction. She listened in silence, waiting for more explanation. He told her it was a once-in-a-lifetime chance to climb the career ladder. And yet he loved her too, and hated the thought of hurting her. Janet tried to keep her composure, though a flood of emotions surged within her. As a trained psychologist, she knew this was not the moment to ask him to give up his dream in a fit of passion. She confessed that her biggest fear wasn't the physical distance, but the changes he had undergone inside. He was no longer the same person. If they continued, they would have to rebuild their relationship on new principles. They gave themselves a week to think, each alone, without pressure or ultimatums. During that time, Tom sought advice from family and friends. Many told him it was his decision to make, though his mother cried at the thought of him living so far away. A close friend in the same field advised him to take the chance, insisting, "These opportunities don't come twice." Janet also spent the week in deep reflection, asking herself if she could handle a relationship at a distance for yet another indefinite period. Could she support him, knowing he was living a totally different life abroad? Should she risk her future in her hometown, waiting for him to return? Or had they simply grown out of this love story, and was it time for both of them to let go? On the decisive evening, they met in the same park where it all began. They sat on a bench, watching people stroll by with their children and dogs, and started talking, openly, without sugarcoating. Tom announced that he planned to accept the offer and remain in Paris for at least the next 6 months, possibly longer. Janet didn't cry or shout. In a calm voice, she replied that she understood his choice, but wanted to focus on her own development at home. She simply couldn't endure another open-ended separation. They parted ways, holding hands and recalling their first meeting, their long talks, and the shared dreams that had once fueled their bond. It was a sad yet insightful moment for both of them. They realized that true love doesn't always end with a fairy tale happily ever after. Sometimes, it's a catalyst that helps two people discover themselves and move forward on separate paths. That is how their story came to a close. Some might call it a sad ending. Others might see it as the natural outcome of two evolving lives. In any case, the sincere feelings sparked on that sunny day in the park remain with them, a memory, an experience, and a push toward a more mature future.